The maitre d' looked at me the way people look at someone who has just walked into the wrong room. Not with hostility. With something worse. Pity. I was standing at the entrance of Sable, one of the most respected fine dining establishments in the Gold Coast, wearing a suit I'd had tailored on Michigan Avenue, holding a reservation confirmation on my phone, and watching a man I recognized sit in a chair that was supposed to be mine. I didn't say anything. Not immediately. I just stood there at the threshold of a private dining room I had booked 8 weeks in advance, in a restaurant where the prix ran $420 a person, at a table set for 14, where every single seat was occupied. Except there was no seat for me. Not an oversight. Not a miscommunication. The chair had been removed entirely. The place setting cleared. The space closed up as though I had never been part of the plan at all. Because, as I would come to understand over the course of the next 3 hours, I hadn't been. My name is Marcus Doyle. I'm 41 years old. I run a commercial real estate development firm out of Chicago, Illinois, and I have spent the better part of the last 12 years building something from the ground up that most people in my industry wouldn't attempt even with backing. I've negotiated deals on properties that other developers walked away from. I've closed transactions in markets where everyone said the timing was wrong. I've sat across tables from people who had more money, more connections, and more leverage than I did and walked away with exactly what I came for. I tell you this not to impress you. I tell you this because it matters for understanding what I did next. Because the man sitting in my chair at that birthday dinner table was named Callum Reyes. He was 34 years old. He was my wife Natasha's college boyfriend. And he had been, for the better part of the last 14 months, the reason she started taking her phone into the bathroom. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here, because the story of how a 41-year-old man ends up standing in the entrance of a private dining room he paid for, watching someone else occupy his seat, is never a simple story. It's always a story that started long before the moment that broke it open. I met Natasha Voss at a charity auction for the Chicago Architecture Foundation 6 years ago. She was 31. I was 35. She had just come off a contract position at a large interior design firm downtown and was starting to build her own client base. She was the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately understand what was wrong with it, spatially, aesthetically, functionally, and tell you how to fix it with a confidence that didn't come from arrogance. It came from actually knowing. I respected that immediately. I understand that quality because I've spent my career developing it in myself. We dated for 14 months. We got engaged in Positano, at a cliffside restaurant she didn't know I'd reserved 3 months in advance. We married the following spring at a venue in Lincoln Park with 160 guests, a dinner catered by someone whose name I'd had to call in a favor to secure, and a honeymoon in the Maldives that cost more than my first commercial property renovation. None of that is bragging. That's context. Because Natasha came from a family that had money for most of her childhood and then suddenly didn't. Her father's business collapsed when she was in her mid-20s, and in the years after that, she had developed a relationship with financial security that was, to put it plainly, complicated. She didn't want to be provided for. She told me that explicitly and repeatedly. She wanted to build something herself. But she also wanted the kind of life that takes either time or resources to construct, and when those two things came into tension, she made choices that I was too close to fully see. I didn't understand that at the time. I understand it now completely. The first year of marriage was good. The second was good. The third is where I started noticing things the way you notice a crack in a foundation wall. Not alarming on its own. But the kind of thing a developer learns to track because small cracks have a way of becoming structural problems if you ignore them long enough. Natasha started spending more time on her phone in the evenings than she ever had before. Not scrolling. Typing. The kind of typing that stops the moment you walk into the room, not because it's guilty exactly, but because it's private in a way that it hadn't been before. She started leaving the room to take calls that she used to take in front of me without a second thought. Her energy shifted around me in a way that's hard to describe but very easy to feel if you've spent 20 years learning to read rooms. She became more interested in her own schedule and less interested in ours. I didn't push. I'm not a person who pushes before I have information. I've learned that in business and it applies everywhere. Pressure without leverage is just noise. So I watched. I filed things away. And I kept doing what I'd always done, which was build, invest, and provide, because that's how I was raised and that's who I am. About 7 months before the birthday dinner, I brought Natasha in to consult on the interior design of a mixed-use development I was completing in the West Loop. It was a significant project. 42 residential units above commercial space. The kind of project that would add substantially to her portfolio if she handled it well. She did handle it well. She was talented. She always had been. I gave her the contract because she earned it, and the work she produced justified that completely. But the meetings for that project introduced her, or rather reintroduced her, to Callum Reyes. Callum was a structural consultant I'd been working with for 2 years. Competent. Good at his job. I had no reason to think anything about him beyond professional. I didn't know until much later that he and Natasha had dated seriously in college, a relationship that ended badly when she moved to Chicago and he stayed in Portland for another 2 years. I didn't know because she hadn't told me. And she hadn't told me because, I would eventually understand, some doors you leave closed not because they don't exist but because you know exactly what's behind them. I introduced them myself at a project walkthrough in November. I stood there and made the introduction and watched them shake hands with the practiced neutrality of 2 people who already know each other very well and have decided not to say so. I missed it entirely. I tell you that not because I'm embarrassed by it, but because it matters. I am a person who reads situations for a living. And I missed it. That tells you something about how thoroughly I trusted my wife. The birthday dinner was her idea. That's important. Natasha turned 37 in March. 6 weeks before the date, she told me she wanted to celebrate properly for once. Her words. For once. As though the weekend in Napa I'd arranged for her 35th hadn't happened, or the private boat charter on Lake Michigan for her 36th. But I didn't say that. I said, of course. What do you want? She wanted a dinner. Private room. Sable on North Rush Street. 14 guests. A custom tasting menu. Champagne on arrival, wines selected to pair with each course, a dessert course with a custom element she'd specified with the pastry chef directly. I handled all of it. I spoke with the events coordinator at Sable 4 times over 6 weeks. The venue deposit alone was $6,000. The per-person cost for the tasting menu and paired wines came to $420. 14 guests. The total, before gratuity, came to just under $7,000 for the dinner itself. The custom floral arrangement she wanted for the center of the table, ordered from a florist she'd specified in Lincoln Square, was another $800. The gift I'd had commissioned, a piece of custom jewelry from a designer she'd admired for years, was a separate matter entirely. I'm giving you those numbers not to perform generosity. I'm giving you those numbers because they become relevant. The dinner was scheduled for a Saturday at 7:30 in the evening. I had been in Milwaukee that afternoon closing the final documents on an acquisition I'd been working on for 9 months, and I told Natasha I'd meet her at the restaurant at 7:15. She said that was fine. She said she'd be there with her friends to make sure everything was set up the way she wanted. She said I should just come directly and she'd see me there. I arrived at 7:12. The maitre d' at Sable knew me. I'd been there a handful of times over the years and I'd spoken with their events team extensively over the preceding 6 weeks. He greeted me by name and then did something I remember clearly now but didn't fully register in the moment. There was a half-second pause before he said, "Mr. Doyle, of course," and gestured toward the private room at the back of the restaurant. I followed him down the corridor lined with those frosted glass panels they used to separate the private dining spaces from the main floor. I could hear voices before I reached the door. Laughter. The particular sound of a group of people well into their first glass of wine. Comfortable. Settled. Together for a while already. I stepped through the doorway. 14 people. Natasha at the head of the table, which I understood. It was her birthday. To her left, her closest friend Danny, who I liked. Beside Danny, another woman from her design network I'd met twice. And then at the seat directly to Natasha's right, the seat where I had always understood I would be sitting, the seat that should have held the reservation card with my name on it the way the other places at the table held theirs, sat Callum Reyes. He was talking to the woman beside him. He hadn't noticed me yet. There was no empty chair. I scanned the table completely. 12 place settings occupied, one at the head where Natasha sat, and one at her right hand where Callum sat. The remaining settings arranged around the table, 12 of them filled, a vase of flowers at the center that I recognized from the order I had placed and paid for. No chair. No place card. No space that said, here is where the person who arranged all of this is supposed to sit. Natasha saw me. She didn't look surprised. That was the thing that landed hardest and fastest. People who have made a mistake look surprised when the consequence walks through the door. She didn't look surprised. She looked like she had made a calculation and was watching it produce the result she had anticipated. Her expression shifted into something that I can only describe as a kind of controlled composure, the face of someone who has already decided what they're going to say. She stood up. I'll give her that. She stood up and she came toward me, which was more than I expected given what I was looking at. Marcus, she said. I didn't realize you were going to make it this early. I looked at her. I looked at the table. Then I looked at her again. Where is my seat, Natasha? Her chin lifted slightly. Things were rearranged a little. We had a last-minute addition and the room fit 14 comfortably, so we adjusted the seating. I looked past her at Callum Reyes, who had now noticed me. He didn't look away. He picked up his wine glass and held eye contact with the particular ease of a man who believes he's already won. I kept my voice exactly level. The way I keep my voice in every room where I know something the other person doesn't know I know. A last-minute addition. I said. You rearranged the seating for a last-minute addition to a dinner I booked and paid for, and the seat that was adjusted out was mine. It's not like that, she said. And the thing about that phrase, it's not like that, is that it is always exactly like that. Without exception. In 12 years of doing business, I have never heard that phrase from someone who then went on to demonstrate that it wasn't like that. What's it like then? I asked. She didn't answer. She looked at me with something complicated in her eyes, something that had guilt in it and something else that I recognized as relief. The kind of relief that comes when a decision you've been delaying finally gets made for you by circumstance. The entire table had gone quiet. 14 people who had arrived to celebrate Natasha's birthday were now watching her husband stand in the doorway of the room he'd reserved and paid for, without a chair. I looked at the table one more time. I looked at the flowers. I looked at the champagne glasses that had already been filled and partially consumed. I looked at Callum Reyes, sitting in my chair, comfortable in the warmth of a room I'd created, and I understood in that moment everything I had been slowly assembling over the past 7 months. People always want to know what I said next. What explosion happened? What scene I made? What did I do? Nothing. In the traditional sense, I did nothing. I looked at my wife and I said, in a voice so quiet that only she could hear it clearly, I hope you enjoy the evening. And then I turned around and walked back down the corridor with the frosted glass panels and through the dining room of Sable on North Rush Street, and I nodded at the maitre d', who watched me leave with an expression that told me he'd understood something about this evening that I was only just catching up to. I stepped outside onto Rush Street. The March air was sharp and cold and honest in the way that Chicago cold always is. Not theatrical. Just real. I stood on the sidewalk for approximately 45 seconds. And then I did what I always do when a situation requires clarity rather than reaction. I made a call. My attorney is a man named Gerald Fitch. Gerald has handled my business affairs for 9 years and my personal legal matters for 4. He is 62 years old, a former litigator who moved into transactional work after deciding that courtrooms were less interesting than contract rooms. He picks up on the second ring regardless of the hour because that is who Gerald is and it's why I pay him what I pay him. Gerald. I said. I need to discuss some things. He heard something in my voice, the particular absence of inflection that I use when a situation is serious and I need to think rather than feel. He said, "Tell me where you are." I told him. There was a pause. "Start from the beginning," he said. So I did. I stood on the sidewalk outside Sable in March in Chicago and I told Gerald Fitch everything I'd been observing for 7 months, and the thing about saying it out loud to someone who operates in facts and implications rather than emotions is that it becomes very clear very quickly what you're actually looking at. Not what you feared. Not what you suspected. What you actually have. Gerald listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said 4 words. "Where are you staying tonight?" I said, "I'll go to the peninsula." He said, "I'll call you at 8 tomorrow morning." I walked to where my car was parked. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. The restaurant was 140 feet behind me. Inside, a dinner was proceeding that I had organized and funded and would not be attending. The flowers were from the florist I'd selected. The wine had been chosen by a sommelier I'd consulted with over 2 phone calls. The pastry chef had spoken with me directly about the custom dessert element. My card was on file for the final bill. I started the engine. I was in my room at the Peninsula on Superior Street by 8:45. I ordered food from room service, something simple, soup and bread, because my appetite had nothing to do with luxury that evening. I poured a drink. Maker's Mark, neat, the kind of drink you pour when you need your mind to work rather than your nerves to settle. And I sat down at the desk and I began doing what I do when a situation moves from observation into decision. I began reviewing. I pulled up 14 months of shared financial records. I am not an impulsive person. I do not make decisions based on what I feel in the moment. I make decisions based on what I can document. I looked at patterns. I looked at time stamps. I looked at the particular geography of charges on shared accounts and the way certain expenses had clustered around certain dates. The picture that assembled itself was not the picture of a wife conducting a casual reconnection with a college acquaintance. Natasha called at 9:14. I let it ring. She called again at 9:31. And again at 9:50. Then messages began arriving, short ones first, the kind of messages people send when they're still deciding what they want to say. "Marcus, please call me. Marcus, I know how this looked." And then, at 10:17, a longer message, the kind that comes when the social portion of an evening has ended and the person is alone with what they've done. "I can explain tonight. I know you're upset. I know it looked bad. But there's context you're missing and I need you to hear me." Context. I've always found that word interesting. Context is what people call the parts of the story they need to add in order for their version to make sense. I did not call back. At 8 the next morning, Gerald Fitch called exactly when he said he would. He had, in the intervening hours, done what Gerald does, which is establish a clear picture of where things stand legally and strategically. He walked me through the landscape in his precise, unhurried way. Illinois is an equitable distribution state, not a 50-50 state. The business assets I built prior to and during the marriage, the structure of them, the documentation around them, these things mattered. He told me what we could establish. He told me what we should document. He told me what the next steps looked like if I chose to take them. I told him to begin. By the following Tuesday, documents had been filed for a formal legal separation. Gerald moved methodically and without drama, the way I prefer things to move. Natasha was served on Thursday morning. I know the exact time because Gerald called to confirm. 10:14 a.m. Her first call to me came at 10:22. Missed. Her second at 10:31. Missed. By noon she had called 11 times and sent 9 messages. I read every message. I didn't respond to any of them. Not because I was punishing her. Because I had nothing to say that would serve either of us, and I've learned to recognize the difference between communication and noise. What I did instead was call Callum Reyes. Now I want to be precise about why, because this is the part where people assume I was emotional. I wasn't. I was methodical. Callum Reyes had been working as a structural consultant on my West Loop project. That engagement was still technically active. The project was 91% complete, but certain final inspections and sign-offs were outstanding, and Callum's firm was part of the documentation chain for those sign-offs. I had, for obvious reasons, some considerations about continuing that professional relationship. I called him not to confront him. I called him to terminate the professional engagement. That was it. That was the only reason. He picked up on the 4th ring. I said, Callum. Marcus Doyle. I'm calling to inform you that I'll be engaging a different firm for the remaining consultancy on the West Loop project. Gerald Fitch will be in touch with the formal notice. A long pause. Marcus, he said. I think there are things you should know about the situation between Natasha and I. I said, I'm not calling about that situation. I'm calling about the professional engagement. Please expect Gerald's correspondence. I ended the call. 3 days later, Natasha and I met. Not because I arranged it. Because Gerald recommended it, for the purpose of establishing clear parameters for the separation process. She arrived at Gerald's office on North LaSalle Street looking like someone who hadn't slept well in days, which I noted without satisfaction. I'm not someone who takes pleasure in another person's distress, even when they've caused my own. She sat across the conference table and she looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. I didn't plan for it to go like that. She meant the dinner. I know, I said. That was a choice, Marcus. She meant the chair. The seating. The removal of my place from the table. Yes, I said. It was. She looked down at the table. I've been trying to figure out how to have this conversation for 4 months. Callum and I, we didn't plan it. I know that's not something that changes anything for you, but I need you to know it wasn't calculated from the beginning. I looked at her steadily. The dinner was calculated, I said. A long pause. Yes, she admitted. I thought if you walked in and saw that I'd moved on, it would make the conversation easier than trying to have it directly. She paused. I know how that sounds. It sounds like a person who wanted to be left rather than have to leave, I said. And her expression when I said that told me that I was right. That I'd named it precisely. People do things like that when they've made up their mind but need the other person to absorb the collision so they don't have to feel like the one who caused it. She didn't argue. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. Natasha retained a competent attorney. Gerald was better. The business assets were correctly characterized and protected. The final settlement was equitable in the legal sense and fair in the practical sense, which is what I'd instructed Gerald to aim for. I wasn't interested in being punitive. I was interested in being clean. Callum Reyes's firm lost 2 other referrals from my professional network in the months that followed. Not because I made calls. Because in a professional ecosystem, when you make certain choices, the information travels on its own. I didn't orchestrate that. I simply didn't prevent it. The dinner bill from Sable, the final bill including the custom dessert, the paired wines, the champagne, the service charge, came to $11,240. The charge appeared on the card on file 3 days after the dinner. I paid it. I want to be clear about that. I did not dispute it. I did not call the restaurant and make a scene. I paid the bill for a dinner I did not attend, at a table where my chair had been removed, because I had given my word to pay for that evening and I don't go back on my word over things like money. What I did do was write a brief and professional note to the events coordinator at Sable, thanking her for the evening and mentioning, factually, that I had not ultimately been able to attend. She responded with a short, gracious note that indicated, without saying so directly, that the staff had noticed my departure and understood more than the evening's surface suggested. These things always travel further than people expect. I moved into my apartment on East Chestnut Street 6 weeks after the separation filing. A high floor, east-facing views, Lake Michigan in the morning from a space that was entirely, uncomplicatedly mine. No shared history on the walls. No second opinions about what went where. A clean slate in the most literal sense. The work helped. It always does. The West Loop project closed successfully. I was already into preliminary discussions on 2 new acquisitions by the time the divorce was finalized. My business, as it turns out, is not contingent on my marriage. It never was. The things I've built are mine in a way that no legal process and no personal betrayal can fundamentally alter. Gerald made sure of that structurally, and I'd made sure of it long before, through years of documentation and discipline and the kind of careful, patient construction that doesn't get undone by a single bad season. I ran into Natasha 4 months after the divorce was final. South Loop, a Saturday morning, outside a coffee place on West Harrison Street. These things happen in a city that is smaller than it looks once you've lived in it long enough. She was with a friend. She saw me first. She stopped. I stopped. "Marcus," she said. "Natasha." A pause that wasn't uncomfortable. Just a pause. "How are you?" she asked. "Good," I said. "Really good." She nodded. "The firm?" "Busy," I said. "New projects?" She smiled slightly, the particular smile of someone who has complicated feelings about news they actually find relieving. She looked well. Put together in a way that told me she was doing the work of moving forward. I respected that. "You look well," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "You were always the most controlled person I'd ever been around," she said. Not as a compliment, but not as a criticism either. Just as an observation. "I know," I said. She nodded again. "Take care of yourself, Marcus." "You too," I said. And that was that. The thing I've turned over the most in the months since isn't the affair. Affairs are a human failing. I understand human failing. The thing I've returned to again and again is the chair. Not what it represented about her feelings. I understand her feelings now in a way I couldn't in the moment. She'd made a decision and she was afraid of the direct conversation, and she engineered a situation that she thought would transfer the agency to me. I understand that. What I keep returning to is the specific calculation of it. She didn't just not invite me. She removed the evidence that I'd ever been part of the plan. A place setting takes 30 seconds to clear. Someone decided to do it. Someone decided that the person who had written every check for this evening, who had made every call, who had arranged every detail, didn't need a physical space in the room he'd created. That told me something very precise about how I had been perceived for longer than I'd understood. And here's the thing about that kind of clarity. It's painful in the way that a clean break is painful. Sharp and immediate rather than the slow chronic ache of something that's been wrong for a long time without your full acknowledgement. I'd been living with the slow chronic ache. What happened at Sable, the empty space where my chair should have been, was the clean break. And clean breaks heal. That's not a comfortable thing to say. It sounds like I'm minimizing what happened, and I'm not. I felt all of it. The disorientation of standing in a room you created without a place in it. The particular humiliation of watching a man you've employed professionally sit in a chair you were supposed to occupy. The cold walk back through the corridor. The decision to leave without a scene. The 45 seconds on the sidewalk. All of it. The way it sat on my chest that night at the peninsula. The way it moved through the work of the following weeks. The way certain ordinary things, a restaurant reservation, a Sunday dinner out, carried weight they hadn't carried before. I felt it completely. I just did not perform it. And there's a reason for that. I've spent 2 decades learning that the most important decisions are made in the moments when performance would be easiest. When someone leaves you a room full of witnesses and a perfect opportunity to be visibly wronged. When the audience is already assembled and the script writes itself. The performance would have felt like something. For about 3 minutes. And then I would have spent years defined by it. My father taught me something when I was young. He wasn't a man of many words. He worked with his hands and he thought carefully before he spoke, and what he said usually mattered. He told me once that a man with real resources doesn't need to demonstrate them. Demonstrating them means you're not sure other people know they're there. I think about that a lot. I didn't make a scene at Sable because I didn't need to. The chair was gone. The person I'd trusted had made her choice. The man she'd chosen was sitting where I was supposed to sit. None of that required my performance to be real. What it required was a decision. And decisions made quietly, without an audience, without noise, are the ones that actually move things. 7 months after the divorce, I was deep into a new development, a boutique mixed-use project in the River North Corridor, the kind of project that requires the particular combination of financial patience and design instinct that I've spent years developing. I was in a meeting with a potential architecture partner when my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. I let it go. Later, I listened to the voicemail. It was the events coordinator from Sable. She said a corporate client had inquired about high-end private dining recommendations for a significant engagement dinner. She'd mentioned my name as someone with a genuine understanding of how to construct an exceptional evening. The inquiry, if I was interested, was for a dinner at a scale and specification level beyond what most private clients arranged. I called her back. The engagement dinner became a professional relationship with a development group out of Atlanta I'd been aware of for years but never had a direct line into. That relationship, which started over a table at the same restaurant where my marriage effectively ended, turned into the largest single transaction I've closed in my career to date. I'm telling you that not because I believe in poetic justice, exactly. Life isn't usually structured that way. But I do believe that how you conduct yourself in a room, even a room where you're being diminished, even a room where your chair has been removed, becomes part of your reputation. And reputation is a long game. I've always played the long game. My name is Marcus Doyle. I'm 41 years old. I build things in this city for a living, and 6 months ago I stood on a sidewalk in March outside a restaurant I'd paid for and made the quietest and most consequential decision I've made in my personal life. I walked away clean. Not because I didn't feel what was happening. Not because I was above it. Because I understood something that took me 2 decades to learn about timing and leverage and the particular power that comes from knowing exactly what you have and refusing to spend it on noise. The room I built for someone who removed my chair is just a room now. The flowers I ordered are gone. The wine I selected has been consumed by people who didn't think to save me a glass. The custom dessert was eaten without me. And I am, for the first time in longer than I'd admitted to myself, sleeping through the night in an apartment where everything on the walls is exactly where I want it and nothing is complicated, and the lake in the morning is clean and blue and impossibly large and entirely indifferent to every small human story playing out along its shore. That's the thing about being removed from a room you created. Sometimes it's the best thing that ever happens to you. Not because the wound isn't real. But because the life on the other side of it is so clearly, undeniably yours. She took her version of me with her when she walked out. The version that tolerated a slow diminishment and called it accommodation. The version that watched something wrong taking shape and waited for it to resolve itself. The version that might have stayed in a seat that was already being taken from him long before the night someone finally cleared it from the table. That version is gone. What remains is the same thing that was always there, built over 20 years of decisions made carefully in difficult moments. It was mine before the marriage and it is mine after, and she didn't take it because she couldn't. You can remove a chair. You cannot remove what a person actually is. And that, in the end, is the only thing that matters. Drop a comment below. Do you think walking away quietly was the right move, or would you have handled it differently? And if this story stayed with you, subscribe. We're here for the real ones.